So you've already heard from two of our panelists, so I'm going to do just some abbreviated introductions. So with us this morning is George Barna. George serves as the Senior Research Fellow for Family Research Council's Center for Biblical Worldview. He's also the Director of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University and the President of Metaformation. George is the author of more than 50 books. He served hundreds of parachurch ministries, thousands of churches, advised presidential campaigns, and even the U.S. military. And it is a joy to have George with us now at FRC. Nancy Pearcy, who you just heard from, she is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. She is a best-selling author, nationally sought-after speaker, and she's currently a fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. And our third panelist is Joseph Backholm, who serves as Senior Fellow of Biblical Worldview and Strategic Engagement here at the Family Research Council. Before joining FRC, Joseph served as a legislative attorney for 3 years and spent 10 years as the president of the Family Policy Institute of Washington in Washington State. So glad you guys are with us. So the title of our panel today is Crisis in the Church. What happens when Christians don't have a biblical worldview? You know, I'm really excited. You know, FRC has cared about the Bible. We've cared about discipleship. We've cared about a biblical worldview since our founding in 1983. But we have really bought completely into what George shared yesterday. You know, that worldview isn't just something that we should casually care about. It isn't just something that's part of the solution. As George said yesterday, worldview is the whole game. And that's what we are really focused in at FRC. You know, there's a lot of crises going on, but at the root of all the crises we deal with is this battle of ideas, this issue of worldview. And so that's why FRC earlier this year did launch our Center for Biblical Worldview. You probably saw our booth in the lobby, but we do have a booth, and some of our first resources is this Biblical Worldview series, deals with all the issues that we're dealing with at our summit. So please feel free to pick up a couple of those for you on your way out. So the goal of our panel this morning is just to have a conversation. I want to go a little bit deeper about the state of worldview in America, because I don't want to just talk about problems or complain about where we are in society. You know, we want to provide solutions. How can we reverse the decline of biblical literacy? How can we reverse some of those sobering numbers that George shared with us yesterday? So George, I do want to start with you as we get started on our panel. You know, some folks who are here with us today or this morning watching online might not have heard your talk yesterday. So I think maybe to start us off, it would be helpful by maybe just summarizing what you said yesterday, specifically what your latest research shows us about the state of the church when it comes to biblical worldview.
Okay. So there are a lot of things that we covered yesterday, but the essence of that is that when we look at America today, only 6% of adults have a biblical worldview. You would expect it to be enormously different in the Christian church across the country. It tends not to be. Depending on how you look at the population, if you look at people who call themselves Christian, which represents 69% of the population, only 9% of those people have a biblical worldview. If you look at individuals who we might classify as born-again Christians, the 28% of adults who say that when they die, they know that they will spend eternity in the presence of God or they'll go to heaven, simply because they've confessed their sins and accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. That group who possess that perspective, the 28% of the population, only 19% of them have a biblical worldview. So as I was showing yesterday, that means that 4 out of 5 people who are what senior pastors tell us they consider to be the backbone of the Christian church in America, 4 out of 5 of them do not have a biblical worldview. If we look at evangelical churches, those churches that claim that the Bible is God's word, that it's reliable, it's true, it's relevant to the way that we live today, what we find is only 21% of the people who attend those churches have a biblical worldview. So we're looking at a nation where even the people who you would expect to try to study the Bible and apply it to their lives in every situation, which is essentially what a biblical worldview is, taking God's principles and making them real in every decision that you have to make. Because your worldview is your decision-making mechanism. It's the filter that helps you understand and interpret and respond to situations based on the principles that you think are real and true and that you want to define who you are and how you live. We're finding that the church in America is not really all that different from the rest of the world. So we really have to pick up the pace on all this. Part of it is because a large proportion of our senior pastors don't have a biblical worldview, and you can't give what you don't have. And another large part of it is that we don't recognize worldview as a critical element. And perhaps the most important part is the other thing I talked about yesterday, which is that a person's worldview begins forming at 15 to 18 months of age and is almost fully formed by the age of 13. You have a period of time after that in your teens and 20s when you refine it, you articulate it, you figure out how to apply it. From your late 20s through the rest of your life, you become an evangelist for your own worldview. So it's imperative that we really focus on children in the development of that worldview.
That's helpful, George. And again, I want to make sure that we're talking about solutions, but before we can talk about solutions, we need to realize what the state of worldview is, not just in our culture, but in the church. And when I travel around the country, George, that's the stat I use that really gets a lot of attention, that although 81% of evangelicals think they have a biblical worldview, and again, these aren't people just self-identifying as evangelical, these are people who, based on our survey, based on their beliefs and practice, they go to church. 81% think they have a biblical worldview, but only 21% actually do. So there's a lot of work that we need to be doing. Professor Pearcy, you just finished talking about competing worldviews and the postmodern worldview. You talk about it in your book, Love Thy Body. And in your book, which is a brilliant book, I know we do have it in the bookstore. I read it in seminary. It's a fantastic book. But one of the things you argue is that at the heart of most of the issues we're dealing with, whether that's transgenderism, homosexuality, abortion, physician-assisted suicide, is what you call a deeply dehumanizing worldview. And so let's get practical on a practical individual level. What are ways that we can kind of push back against this deeply dehumanizing worldview, this postmodern ethic that is just in the air we breathe?
Yeah, the reason I focus on the body in a book called Love Thy Body is that the postmodern worldview actually denigrates the body and our physical identity. And what I've found is that many Christians have a hard time coming against the postmodern worldview because the Christian church has also tended to denigrate the body. Here's how one of my students put it. She said, growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad. That's how she summarized it. And we do have a reputation in the church of denigrating this world, right? Saying this world doesn't matter. What matters is the spiritual realm. Our bodily life, in this world doesn't really matter. It's not really very important. And so what I have found is that as a result, we don't know what to do with the postmodern worldview. Our Christian apologists have been pretty good at arguing against the materialism, naturalism, the secular worldview that says this world is all that exists. But they haven't been so good at arguing against the postmodern worldview, which is very different. Instead of saying this world is all that exists, it says, well, who cares about this world? All that cares is our mind, our feelings, our sense of self. And that's how we're getting things like transgenderism, homosexuality, and as I showed, even the life issues are saying, who cares about the body? The fetus is human, biologically human, physiologically human, genetically human, but who cares? That's essentially the postmodern view. And so the thing that we need to get our minds around is being human is no longer enough for human rights. Merely, quote unquote, merely being human is no longer enough for human rights. And of course, the argument for euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, which I didn't have time to talk about, it's just the same logic in reverse. In other words, if abortion is based on the idea that the fetus is human, But as long as it's just human, it's just a piece of matter. It can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be subject to experiments. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. And that's exactly how medical journals refer to the fetus, as medical waste. So the lesson here is the divided concept of the human being I talked about. As long as it's human, it is not seen to have any legal rights, any moral status. It has to become a person. Well, of course, euthanasia is the opposite, or the reverse. If you lose a certain level of cognitive functioning, if you lose a certain level of mental ability, then you are no longer a person. And as the secular bioethicists will say, now you are only a body. Only a body. Now you are only human. So once again, whether we're talking about abortion or the reverse logic, euthanasia, being human is no longer enough for human rights. When I talk to Christian audiences, I say to them, you guys haven't figured out yet. We still think as long as you're a member of the human race, you have a right to life. Well, since Roe v. Wade, you actually don't. Technically speaking, being human does not qualify you for legal rights. So the upshot is, the positive take-home then is to be positive, is to use that positive language. I have found that in Christian churches, schools, seminaries, where I speak, one of the hardest things for people to get their mind around is just starting to use the positive language. Over against the secular worldview, Christianity has a much higher view of our life in this world. We're, like I said at the end, we're known for being negative. This, your sin, it's wrong, don't do it. But we miss, Francis Schaeffer used to put it this way, the Christian message doesn't start with, you're a sinner, you need to get saved. It starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And therefore, since you are made in God's image, you have great dignity and value. That's the starting point. So using the positive language of, yes, we're made in God's image, we have you honor your body, respect your biological sex, live in harmony with the Creator's design. The first step is just changing your language, is what I've found. So that's a very positive, very concrete first step.
That's so helpful. And what I'm hearing you say, Professor Pearcy, is, we used to hear people say ideas have consequences. Worldviews have consequences, and sometimes they're deadly. The worldview, these fundamental convictions, the lens through which you see the world, this is going to affect how you see all these issues: abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism. Joseph, let me come to you on this. Probably some of the folks here might listen to our FRC's daily national radio program, Washington Watch with Tony Perkins, which you guest host every so often on Fridays. And whenever you do guest host, you and I get to have a segment, a Worldview segment. We've been doing this, I don't know, maybe 10 months or so. And what I've found is, whatever we're talking about, whether it's abortion, religious liberty, recently government overreach, if you really boil it down to what we're talking about, we're often talking about competing claims that come from competing worldviews. So as we're just helping people kind of get clarity on how significant and far-reaching worldview is, can you maybe help us think a little bit about how worldview does affect these cultural issues and these political issues that we deal with?
It's kind of the question for a lot of what we're doing here. And very quickly, I'd like to clarify how I think about what worldview is, because we have that foundation of this, because we think we know what we're talking about. How I describe that is your assumptions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And there are different assumptions that everyone has. We aren't always conscious of those, but where did I come from? Different answers to that question, different assumptions. Does my life have meaning? Yes, no, or why? And why, if the answer is yes. Who determines what is right and wrong? Me, God, Gallup? Who determines that? And then what happens when I die? Do I fade to black? Do I go to heaven? Do I go to hell? Do I come back as Bernie Sanders? Whatever that is, there's different answers to those questions. So, because that's our worldview, most people and I think your research suggests that most of us we're not conscious, we're not purposeful about the assumptions that we say we make. If I'm a Christian, therefore I believe God created me, He determines what's right and wrong, He gives my life meaning, and I'm accountable to Him. That's what we say we believe as Christians, but we don't take those assumptions and then connect the dots to everything that we believe in public policy. And because there's so much pressure to believe the correct things politically about gender, about human sexuality, about marriage, now about things like CRT, and all of these divisive issues, the question in worldview formation and what we think about politics, to me, is my worldview forming my politics, or are my politics forming my worldview? And as Christians, we're supposed to start with a foundation of, this is what God said is true about the world. I know that's true. Therefore, I'm going to make sure everything I think about X, Y, and Z is actually based on these assumptions about what God said is true. But most of us aren't doing that. We have all these pressure to be good people and to prove we're good people by thinking the correct things about X, Y, and Z. And we know we have to think these things to prove that we're good people. And so we're going to form a worldview deductively after we've formed our political opinions and made sure our worldview fits our political conclusions, rather than make sure that our political conclusions are based on our worldview.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. And that's, we at FRC, we care about politics. My goodness, we care about elections. We care about all these issues. But if underneath all that is one's worldview, this fundamental orientation, these deep beliefs, deep convictions, that's why this is so important. And to George's research, I think, George, when I was listening to you talk yesterday, when you said, when someone dies, they're pretty much dying with the same worldview they had when they were 13 years old. It might be a little bit more refined. They might be able to articulate it a little bit more, but it's pretty much what they had when they were 13. So, George, I'll come back to you. I want to begin helping people have some solutions. What Nancy said, we want to have some positivity. And I actually wrote down something you said at the end of your presentation, George. You said, when it comes to worldview development, parents must lead. You said schools, churches, and society may assist, but parents must lead. So just practically speaking, what are some ways that grandparents and parents can help catechize their children, can begin developing, discipling their children, the children that God's entrusted with to them? What are some practical ways that parents can lead on this?
Every day we have opportunities and experiences to teach our children things. There are a couple of things that come to mind. One of those is something else I discussed yesterday, which is that the most significant influence on the development of a worldview in America today is what we absorb from the media. And if that's the case, then that says to me as a parent or a grandparent or somebody who cares about the development of the worldview of children, that I've got to pay attention to what media is investing in those children's minds and hearts. And with parents, when I talk to parenting groups, I say there's 4 things that I'd suggest you do related to media, the 4 M's. First thing you've got to do is monitor what these kids are being exposed to, because our research shows that most parents are happy to buy their children every device the kids want, and then they leave the kids up to determine what they're going to take in through all those devices. They don't even know what their kids are being exposed to. So you got to monitor it. Second thing I suggest they do is minimize it, because our research also shows that in America, the biggest addiction in our country is media. We spend more time literally absorbing messages from media than anything else we do except for sleep. And there are certain periods in a person's life where we spend more time with media than we do sleeping. So the enormous exposure that we have to that kind of information, we need to put a cap on it, just like we would anything else. We don't tell our kids, eat everything in the house. We tell them eat a certain amount of things a couple of times a day, 3 times a day. We need to do the same kind of ingestion methods with media. Third thing I suggest that they do is they mediate that media, meaning that you serve as the mediator between what the media is trying to get you to believe and what we as followers of Jesus believe based on what the scriptures teach. And so being able to make the connection between, did you see what Disney was just telling you? That's an element about how you can live your life, but we know that's a lie. How do we know that? Because the scriptures teach us this. We see it in this story. We see it in real life. And so connecting all those dots for the kids. In our schools now, we don't do that. In our Sunday schools, we don't do that. So it's up to parents really to take the time to know the story, the narrative that's being shoved down the throats of our kids, and being there to say, okay, let's think about that for a moment. And then the final end will be to moralize it, helping them to understand the difference between right and wrong. Is that a good narrative or a bad narrative? Why? What does it look like in practice? What should you do as a follower of Jesus? Here's what we believe, here's how we live. So I think if parents simply did that in the lives of their kids, it would revolutionize America today. So we've got to be more attentive to what's happening in that realm.
That's really helpful, George, the 4 M's. Can you say those 4 real quick again, just the 4 M's?
Yeah, it's to monitor, to minimize, to mediate, and to moralize.
Good. Okay, that's for all you who have taken notes, the 4 M's. That's good. Joseph and Nancy, would you add anything when we think about catechizing, discipling our children? Anything else to what George just said?
Well, I've got a lot. I have 3 teenage daughters right now, and it is a constant battle. For all of you young people, I would say, this is a sidebar, but I think it's related. Don't marry someone lazy. And maybe the most important reason not to marry somebody lazy is because parenting is exhausting. It's exhausting. And we have some parents here. And truly, the pressure to surrender is perpetual because they're constantly asking for things you know are not good for them. And you're constantly like, I need to deal with that, I need to deal with that, I need to deal with that. But it takes so much energy. The pressure to say, fine, just do what you want to do is overwhelming. But to your point, George, if you just say, fine, do what you want to do, that's terrible for them. It's terrible for them. And so working with our kids and realizing, and you made that point, that they are being catechized by everything that's happening in their life. And we just have to be super attentive to the fact that YouTube has them more than we have them, even if we don't want them to, even if they're careful. And the onslaught of media messages. When I was in high school, my parents were always talking about getting us ready for college so that we went to college and we were prepared to respond to these ideas. Now you have to get kids ready for 4th grade. Because that's when their friends have phones, that's when they have phones, that's when the kids that they're talking about at lunch are on YouTube and they're bringing all these ideas to them and they're being exposed to all this stuff really, really early. And so we have to be giving them an overflow of what we are ingesting ourselves so we understand these ideas, why they matter, why that's a bad idea, why that's a good idea, be able to understand it ourselves so we can teach them. Because otherwise, the gravitational pull culturally is in a really bad direction.
Yeah, that's helpful, Joseph, and I'll just jump in quick and add, look at the studies with, if someone has a worldview by the time they're 13, that's sobering, that's haunting. For me at FRC, that we need to act on that. And so that's why in May we launched our Center for Biblical Worldview. And you can see us at frc.org/worldview. And in the coming weeks and months, we're going to be releasing more and more resources. We're talking with different curriculum developers to come up with children's curriculum, Sunday school curriculum, YouTube videos, because I truly believe that as a parent, you are the primary disciple maker in your child's life, but we want to come alongside you to help you. And so some of this stuff is in the works. frc.org/worldview email. It's a monthly email that we send out. And as we roll out these resources, we'll be letting you know about these because we really do want to help you. Because it's a battle. It's a battle for the hearts and minds of our children. And we really do want to come alongside churches and parents to help you walk this walk. Nancy, I'm going to come to you with our next question because I know we've talked about the family, we've talked about the individual. I want to go back to the church now. I know there's pastors here at our conference, pastors watching online, and this summer especially I've done a lot of traveling, and the statistic I've shared with pastors that really seems to get their attention is the one I mentioned, George. 81% of those who attend evangelical churches think they have a biblical worldview, but when you actually measure for belief and practice, it's only 21%. And most pastors just are astounded by that. And so what advice, Nancy, would you give to pastors for how they can help their church members develop this biblical worldview, or at least even help their congregation to realize how important this conversation is that we're having right now?
Yeah, my one-line response is apologetics from the pulpit. Apologetics from the pulpit. In other words, anytime you introduce a biblical doctrine, you tell people how to defend it. Because as soon as they walk out of the sanctuary, it's going to be attacked. We need to be equipping people with the tools to face the attack that they're going to face. Like I said, as soon as they go out of the sanctuary, it's not like they're going to. In the past, I think people kind of relied on the fact that we had a cultural Christianity, right? I moved to Texas from Washington, D.C. I used to live here in Washington, D.C., where the fault lines are much clearer. Then I moved to Texas, where there is more cultural Christianity. And I'm finding that I have to help my students to be aware of the importance of having a biblical, not just having a biblical worldview, but also how to defend it. And I wanted to build a little bit more on how young children are picking up a secular worldview. Did you notice the Blue's Clues slide that I showed? Parents report that we haven't talked about the public schools yet. Parents report that their children are coming home saying, my teacher said just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. Just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. There was actually a lawsuit brought by parents. It was in the news, so that's how we knew about it. But her daughter, first grade, came home saying just that, Mommy, what am I? How do I know what I am? And she literally said to her mother, please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am. And the parents had taken a lawsuit against their school for emotional distress. But I think what we have to realize is today, on the transgender movement, there's been a huge increase among teenage girls. When I have a longer presentation, I show the slides from all the modernized world, so U.S., Britain, Australia, most of the modern cultures. If you look at the graphs, the number of girls claiming transgender identity goes like this and then like this. It's phenomenal. So there's certainly a huge trend right now for teenage girls to claim a transgender identity. And here's what I find most troubling. It used to be from the internet. They used to be getting it off social media, and to some degree they still do. But what you're seeing now is a trend towards, I got it at school. It was from the public school that I got the idea that maybe I was really a boy, that really I was the opposite sex. So we need to realize, fourth grade's too late, Joseph.
Fair enough.
It's kindergarten now. That we need to be aware that our kids are being exposed to secular worldviews from a very young age, from their from the Saturday morning cartoons. And pastors need to be aware that this is what parents are up against. If they're not paying attention, they're not equipping their parents. And I agree with George Barna that parents are primary. But pastors need to come alongside them, realizing what they're up against. I did talk to, I visited a Lutheran church. I'm Lutheran background, so I was visiting a Lutheran church, and somebody had read my books and said to the pastor, oh, you probably have her books on your shelf. And he said, no, I don't read apologetics. And that's what I hear from a lot of my readers. They say, how do I get my pastor to care about this? So I think that is the first step in the church. We need to get the leadership, the pastoral staff, to understand they're not equipping their congregation if they're not giving them apologetics, and apologetics they can then share with their children.
George, Joseph, would you add specifically when it comes to pastors?
Well, I want to pick up on the point that you made about you got to get them ready for kindergarten, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're right, but we also have to recognize that you can't get them ready for kindergarten. Kindergarten minds are not ready to engage the battle of ideas. So we as parents, as stewards of children, we have to think about the environment that we're placing our kids in. No kindergartner is ready to navigate that. And so there are 16,000 hours between kindergarten and 12th grade. That if you go through the typical educational experience that you're going to spend in a classroom, You cannot overcome the impact of those 16,000 hours by taking them to school on Sunday and maybe taking them to youth group on Wednesday night. Impossible. Okay? And think about this with your kids, with our kids as we train them. They're cucumbers that are becoming pickles. And the brine that they soak in has a lot to say about what they become. It's not even, even if you have teachers who not are aggressively teaching them terrible things, which some of them are. Even if you don't have those teachers, you manage to avoid them. They're still soaking things in from the culture that's around them, that's influencing what they love, which the research tells us what they love determines what they ultimately believe is true. So we have to be really purposeful about those 16,000 hours. And don't look at this as just, I'm going to spend the next 12 years trying to protect my kids from all the pagan lies. Why don't we take those 16,000 hours and invest in them in goodness and truth and say these are the moments where we can build them into the culture changers we want them to be, not just try to prevent them from being atheists by the time they get to college.
And I guess I would add to that, there are 16,000 hours between K and 12. There are 32,000 hours during that same period of time of media exposure for those same children. Right. And the challenge that we face is that those schools that most of our kids are going to are laying a foundation that the media then supports. Right. And so it's in essence 48,000 hours worth of content.
It's catechism.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's inescapable. It's almost inhuman. The other thing, you started out by asking what should pastors be thinking about. And I keep going back to studies we've been doing each election cycle. And one of the things that we continually find is that most pastors believe that the Bible speaks to every issue that's germane to the campaigns taking place. But we also find that very, very few of them are personally willing to speak to what the Bible says about those issues. Yeah. And so the consequence of that, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, is that we found in the last two presidential cycles, our polling has shown that the people who were least likely to discuss their personal beliefs or positions on issues as conservative Christians with other people who they knew believed differently, conservative Christians were the least likely to be talking about what they believed. And the reason was because they're not sure what they believe, because they're not sure what the Bible teaches, because their pastors aren't helping them to understand those things. Now, it's not all on the pastor. We have a personal responsibility to be reading and studying the Bible, coming to our own conclusions about these things. But if pastors would encourage us to be doing that and greasing the path there, by laying a foundation of here's some things for you to be reading, to be thinking about, to be praying about, books to be reading on these issues, helping us down that path, that would be enormously valuable.
That's really helpful, George. And another thing I'd add practically is when you're looking at churches to see if this is a good church, maybe where the Lord's calling you, does the pastor preach expositionally? Do they actually walk through books of the Bible? Because there's a lot of issues we deal with, and there's not necessarily a "thus saith the Lord" on every single issue. There's not a chapter and verse that we can point to for every issue. But the Bible does address a lot of issues. The Bible has a lot to say about the personhood of the unborn. It has a lot to say about the family. It has a lot to say about life. And so we need to be going to churches where the pastors are going to God's Word. Because at the end of the day, my opinion doesn't matter. Y'all's opinions, they're well-informed, but they don't matter. What really matters is God's Word. And that's why this biblical worldview is so important. We want to be tethered to God's Word. Because that's the objective standard. That's the standard. That's where we're going to find truth. It looks like we're basically out of time. So let me just add real quickly, again, the Center for Biblical Worldview, we've been up and running for just a couple of months. We do have a table out there where you can see some of the resources that we've been developing. And there's so much more we could talk about: education within the church, all sorts of things. We're going to hopefully be producing more and more resources to come alongside you guys, because these are tricky issues. Some of them are complex. They're not easy. But that's why the Center for Biblical Worldview exists, to come alongside you, to help you think more faithfully about these issues. And again, all that's at frc.org/worldview. But would you please now join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you.